I'm Caroline Modaressy-Tehrani, and you're watching WMN on HuffPost Live, where we talk about the biggest stories about and by women in the news each week. Now, this coming Sunday, March 8th, marks International Women's Day. It's a time of year where we can take stock of the landscape for women across the globe, every woman of every race, class, geography and creed. And joining me now to take a look at where things stand in 2015, we have Jessica Neuwirth, the Director of Donor Direct Action, Patricia Morris, the President of Women Thrive International, and joining us via webcam we have Amber Khan, the Senior Director of Communications at Women for Women International. So I want to thank you all so much for joining me today, and very exciting ahead of International Women's Day. But I want to start with something that's difficult for us a lot of the times to swallow. And it's hard, if not impossible, to separate the status of a woman from the politics of her surroundings, perhaps the hardest of which is women in conflict. From government law to terrorist groups, the safety and security of women around the world is far from promised. And Amber, I want to start with you. Women for Women International looks very specifically at female survivors of war, and we're seeing conflict in Syria, Nigeria, Iraq, to be honest, too many countries to name. How is conflict impacting women?
Well, that's a great question. Conflict is impacting women in a variety of ways. I mean, conflict not only destroys networks and prevents the ability of women to be able to have those supports and access to education and being able to feel not only physical security, but personal security, it also displaces them. And it puts women into situations in which they are not only isolated and often marginalized, but they are also doubly experience the challenge of having to support their families, because conflict typically leaves many women responsible with household responsibilities as well as overseeing and supporting the household. And that challenge is quite significant. And it's the reason why Women for Women International, frankly, was formed 20 years ago, because after the Balkans War, we saw that women were not only targeted with gender-based violence, but that resources to support them so that they could become sustainable, recover, and find a safe space were not available. So that's why we developed our program. And unfortunately, that need exists even more today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Jessica, talk to me a little bit about some of the conflict we're seing. Syria kind of comes to mind, because when Amber's talking about displaced women, I feel like that's what we've seen so much of late, particularly with the refugees. Huge refugee camps now are based in Jordan, in Turkey. How does Direct Donor Action sort of see that playing out?
Well, I would echo this idea that women are really disproportionately harmed by armed conflict, and it's not only the displacement, it's the sexual violence, which maybe in the past was more considered like a byproduct of war, and now women are specifically targeted because I think there's an understanding that when you destroy women, you destroy their families, you destroy their communities, and so they become a really intentional target of war. And then there's the displacement, which makes them vulnerable again to violence and all of the lack of security that was mentioned. So that's the harm. But I think on the flip side of it, when you look at countries like Syria, and we work to support a group in Syria of women called the Syrian Women's Forum for Peace, there's the completely untapped potential of women as peacemakers.
Yeah.
And the idea that women have a really important role to play that they haven't been allowed to play, although there's been a lot of rhetoric going back to 2000 when the UN passed Security Council Resolution 1325, saying that women really have a lot to bring to the peace table, and yet women have still been fighting to get to the peace table. And I think their investment in peace is a lot greater than almost anyone because they suffer so much from war.
I think that's an excellent point. And particularly, we had Madeleine Rees last year, at the beginning of last year, it was last January, when the talks were supposedly going to happen in Geneva. Not one woman around the table when it came to the peace talks and negotiating. I mean, Patricia, just how damaging is it when women are not at the table for things like that, like peace talks?
I mean, it's significantly damaging, because what you really have, and the people who tend to be at the negotiating tables are the people who were involved in the conflict to begin with. All of the major military leaders, they absolutely demand a place at the table. But the people who are going to build a future of the country, primarily women, are not at the table, and they should be, because they're the ones who really have the future of the country in mind. It's not about their own personal aggrandizement. It's about really healing and then developing the country. So women need to be at the table. I mean, we saw that in Liberia, where the women really protested and forced the men to come to the table in Ghana and, you know, develop a peace agreement. It wouldn't have happened if the women hadn't pushed. They'd probably still be there. You know?
I think it's an excellent point. You know, Amber, you know, it's like Jessica was saying, you know, there have been UN resolutions being passed, supposedly pressure to get women to the table. Why isn't it happening? You know, where are the real roadblocks for women to have a seat at the table?
I think there are many, and I think the distinction between having a legal framework that encourages participation and inclusion versus having the cultural and political environment in which women are in a position to participate and have access to participate is the challenge. So while you hear about 1325, especially in countries in which women are not only disproportionately impacted, they're also excluded from the conversations and from the ability to bring insights forward. And that challenge, you know, the reason why, there are many. I mean, first and foremost, women tend to be isolated and marginalized, not only physically, but in terms of access to education and the opportunity to be able to contribute and participate in those community level conversations. And isolation breeds not only a lack of confidence, but it also diminishes your understanding of what you have an ability and opportunity to participate in. And that's one of the things that we found in our work, Carolyn, in 8 countries, which is when we work with women, bring them together and we inform them and talk about what their legal rights are, what their human rights are, they become emboldened and support each other and then begin to push and fight to assert their right to participate. And so I think part of the challenge is not only the exclusion, but the need for safe spaces for women to come together to organize and to be able to bring solutions and insights to those peace tables at the community level, at the regional level, and at the national level.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and particularly when we're talking about safe spaces. And, you know, particularly, I mean, staying with Syria for a moment, we've seen obviously the rise of ISIS in Syria and the most recent headlines about how ISIS is using marriage as a trap. You know, when we see those sort of situations where the region is so unstable, where, you know, even the Western governments are not quite sure who to back and how to help, what do we do as, you know, outsiders looking in on these kind of situations to be able to fully emancipate women from that awful situation?
I think that's easy. I think what we have to do is strengthen women on the front lines. And that's what Donor Direct Action is working to do, is to channel support directly to the women who are in those war zones, who are trying to organize, who are fighting for peace, and who have a lot of really smart political ideas about how to get to peace. So on the one hand, we have to really strengthen those women's organizations and make their voices heard. And on the other hand, politically, I think we have to hold governments and the UN accountable for all of these promises, because as you mentioned, they're there, they're ready, they're willing. We want to get them at the peace table. And I've heard women say to me from Syria, you know, the price of admission is a gun. If you don't have a gun, and it makes sense in a short-term way, you can see that governments in the UN want to bring all the people fighting together. But the problem is that empowers all those people who have guns, and it disempowers all of the people who want peace and who have ideas about how to get to peace. So I'm very optimistic that if we can get women in through those doors and give them a chance to play a role, that peace will be much easier to achieve.
I mean, let's talk for a second about how women are figuring a role, you know, in all of this, in the conflict. A lot of women are taking on guns now. You know, I've got a headline here, this is from NBC News earlier. Meet the Kurdish women fighters fighting ISIS in Syria, and it's a fantastic series. Erin Trieb has reported on the Women's Protection Unit. It's a 7,000-strong Kurdish military group that's operating right now, and you can see some of the gorgeous images. There'll be more of those if you click on the link in the resource well. But you know, this is an interesting kind of shift, isn't it, Patricia, that we're seeing? We're seeing all of a sudden women adopting arms, being on the front lines. How does that shift where women figure in these arguments, particularly when we start then talking about nation building, post-conflict?
Well, actually, it's not as much as a shift as we would think. I mean, throughout the recent history, women in, various conflicts have been combatants. What has been really very interesting is that in almost all of the cases, once the conflict is over, there's this re-domestication that happens where the society says, now it's time for you to go back and do your real role. You were only a combatant because it was a special, situation. One of the places where we have seen that women have been able to transfer their combatant role into a political role is in Rwanda.
Yeah.
Right? And where, we know that Rwanda has one of the, largest numbers of women in formal politics at all levels.
Yeah.
And so they've been able to do that there. But in most places, even here in the U.S., right, women were told to go back home after they've been involved. So it'll be really very interesting to see what happens to the Kurdish women and if they're going to be able to transfer that into political power and rights and empowerment for women after the conflict.
Yeah, I think
it's hard to say
it's an
because
excellent point.
It hasn't really happened very often.
Yeah, Amber, what do you think about that?
Rwanda is a really great example, and I'm glad Patricia brought that up, because the engagement of women in the kind of recovery and rebuilding of Rwanda, it's a place where Women for Women has been operating immediately after the genocide ended. And what we found is that what has been essential to that process is equipping women with skills so that they can enter into different trades to be able to earn an income and add value to their local community and to their regions. And that recognition plays a very significant role alongside with the political support for ensuring and championing that all women participate. And I want to make that point again, which is when we're talking about the gap between the haves and the have-nots, and we think about it in the U.S., when you think about countries in conflict, that gap and that inequity leads to wide swaths of women, in particular, finding themselves without skills and access to the opportunities in the formal and informal sectors in these post-conflict regions. And so when the government, the newly established government, makes it a priority that women are represented in the parliament, in the provincial councils, in the regional councils, but also establishes workforce development authorities that is staffed and supported to work with partners, NGOs, as well as businesses to encourage and ensure that there is a pipeline and an opportunity for women to continuously develop their skills, you see progress. And Rwanda is a wonderful place to see that, because it's not only where progress is being made, there's still work to be done. And it is a 20-year lesson. And Bosnia is another place that I would point to. When we started our work in Bosnia, and our lesson was that the challenges women still face are significant, but when they are able to come together and find a safe space to be able to solve the problems that they see in their families and in their communities, and there is a legal framework to support their ability to own property, to open a bank account, to assert their right if they become a widow, those legal frameworks are essential, especially in post-conflict situations, because it's still fragile.
And Amber, I think you're absolutely right. And when we're talking about safe space as well and some of these rights, Jessica Neuwirth, who's watching, also adds, I think it's a very important note, accessibility of birth control is a huge obstacle. I think that people underestimate the link between the availability of birth control and poverty, and I think that's even more exacerbated in post-conflict nations. But let's stick with this theme of leadership for a minute, because getting women in positions of leadership is at the heart of ensuring women's issues are brought to the table. In Afghanistan, President Ashraf Ghani spoke out on Thursday in Kabul at an event ahead of International Women's Day to underscore his apparent commitment to female education, and he added, quote, "Violence and discrimination against women has no place in government departments, universities and schools." Well, sadly, discrimination appears rife in Afghanistan's parliament. Ghani put forward 3 women out of 25 total positions to be part of his cabinet in February, and not one of them made the cut. Now, women's groups have called on Ghani to look at a new list of candidates that they've delivered and demanded that his cabinet is made up of at least 38% of women. Jessica, what do you think about this? I mean, do you feel like in those situations, often the politicians just all rhetoric, the eyes of the world are upon them, and this is just nothing more than style as opposed to substance?
Well, I think the president actually had promised in advance that they had both promised that they were going to put 4 women forward. They only put 3 women forward. And the other part of women's leadership, I think we have to remember and really pay tribute to the women who are on the front lines of this battle. I mean, so many women policemen in Afghanistan have been killed. Women running for parliament have been killed. And they're willing to take those risks because they know how important it is for their country to move in the right direction. And I think they really need and deserve support at the highest level. And so when even 4 to me seems like way too little, but I think that the Afghan constitution really underwent a lot of battle zones to get a constitutional provision for equality for women. And now it's really important that people take that seriously and try to put women in those positions. And I think the leadership has to start at the top.
Yeah, again, Patricia, it's sort of that thing, though. It's like, how do you enforce it, right? I mean, we've already dealt with that, America being in, and then people saying they shouldn't have been involved in the first place, and that they should extract themselves, which they've started to do. So what happens next? I mean, where is that pressure supposed to come from in order to make people, make good on their promises?
The pressure is going to come from the Afghan women. Yeah, and I've done a lot of work in Afghanistan. I've been on the board of the Afghan Women's Writing Project. I actually worked for Women International. And I can tell you that Afghan women have been and continue, to advocate for women's rights. And they also advocate not only for, leadership positions for women, but they are pushing their government to address gender-based violence issues, to address issues in terms of education, women's economic empowerment, you making sure that the government, has, a requisite amount of women working in government in Afghanistan. Now, there's still resistance to that. But one of the things that we do at Women Thrive, and that we really want to encourage people to do as we think about International Women's Day, is that we need to grow the international women's movement, and we need to have women everywhere speaking for and supporting the rights and empowerment of women. It is so critical, and we can't let go of it. And we need to be providing that support to these brave women in Afghanistan who are willing to risk their lives. Well, and women in other places, in Iraq and Syria.
It's an excellent point, particularly when you're talking about women doing it for themselves, because I think that then for a long time there'd been this kind of prism, hadn't there, Amber, where, women from supposedly democratized countries, although we're still fighting over birth control and abortion rights in our country, so what the hell do we know?
Right, and political representation.
There you go. Absolutely. I mean, we're hardly at an equilibrium here, but there's a kind of misconception that, we need to be helping them out. How do we empower women in the likes of Afghanistan without smothering them?
Look, I think that what you just touched on is a really critical point. I mean, one of the things that Women for Women, we work around the globe, and the bulk, we have 500, global team members, and the majority of them are not here. They're actually country-based. So in Afghanistan, our country office, which has trained now more than 50,000 Afghanistani women and engaged men in understanding the importance of women's rights, has been really instructive in what you're kind of pointing to. It's the women who are, again, identifying what are the issues and articulating in their voice, on their terms, what are the challenges and obstacles that they're facing and the strategies they want to use to move them forward. I think
that's great. That's a really great point.
Critical.
Their voice as well. Jessica, what were you going to say about that?
Donor Direct Action partners with a group in Afghanistan called HACA, Humanitarian Assistance for Children and Women of Afghanistan, and they run a series of shelters, legal aid. You see the cases, they're just heartbreaking, forced marriage cases, honor killing cases. So you have this leadership question, but you also have a very serious protection question, and I think channeling support, a little money goes a really long way in Afghanistan, and yet you see these big international organizations there. And Donor Direct Action has a very different approach. We don't have any bureaucracy, and we just partner with organizations like HACA that are totally Afghan run, because we feel that getting the money to them will be the most effective way to help women in the country. Again, just a few $100s, you can hire a lawyer for a month, which
Yeah.
is unheard of here. You can create a shelter, and they don't have enough resources. They don't have the visibility. They don't have the funding. But they do so little with so much. And if they got so much with so little, and if they got a little bit more, I think we could really see a great impact in strengthening the women's movement that would trickle up.
I think that's really fascinating as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It really is about partnerships. Women
is.
Thrive. We have a global partners network, over 100 women's NGOs in 35 countries. So we work together with them on identifying the issues and developing advocacy campaigns to promote, the issues and the perspectives and the solutions that women have for today's problems. And that's what it's about. It's not about empowering women. Women already have power. It's about harnessing it, and it's about supporting it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And, I'm glad you brought up forced marriages as well, Jessica, because I've got a tweet here from Sunny Hundal who said forced marriages are on the increase in the UK, as according to the joint head of the government forced marriages unit. I'm not surprised, no convictions yet, though. Once again, really underscoring the fact that by no means do Western nations have it all figured out. I think that we're all still going through a lot of these problems that are affecting communities across the nation. And I want to just touch on a point that we haven't really mentioned yet, the elephant in the room, men. Because women in Afghanistan also had some more support from men in the country of late. Reuters reports that a group of men in Kabul took to the streets alongside the action group Afghan Peace Volunteers to march for women's rights. Now, the men wore burqas and marched to highlight violence against women in a country where honor crime is common. Now, the group of men figured about 20, so a small contingent to be sure. But, why do you think this is really important to highlight, Amber? Why do you think so?
Well, I think it's critical. In Afghanistan, we run our Women for Women Afghanistan country programs run a men's engagement program in which they engage specifically religious leaders and tribal leaders to educate them in a culturally sensitive and appropriate way on women's rights in Islam. And the impact is phenomenal. 2 years after going through the training, men report, more than half of them report that they are standing up for and advocating for ending gender-based violence that they witness at home and in their community. And, there's more information of this on our website. But, when you ask the question why, I think that men want to end violence. And that's something that we hear in the groups, that when men come together and talk about the challenges that they're facing and the insecurity and the threats that their wives, their mothers, their daughters face, the desire to live in a secure and a safe home is not a unique concept or idea that we want. It's something that everyone wants.
Yeah.
And it's not surprising to me that men are standing up in Afghanistan, and they are allies to women. And I think that when you talk about these political shifts and these culture shifts, it's not going to happen in a silo. It's not just legal. It's not just going to be social. It's not just going to be economic. We've got to recognize that we need an integrated approach to investing and supporting our allies around the world who want to create a more equitable place for all women to succeed and to thrive. And
I think that's a great point.
The way we work.
That's a great point, Amber. It really is.
The fact of the matter is that women are not islands.
No.
They are in relationships. They have fathers, they have brothers, they have husbands, they have sons, and many of those men want the best for the women in their lives.
That's the curious thing, because I feel like there is almost this subconscious racism that goes on sometimes when we're talking about countries like Afghanistan, like Syria, where we assume that all men want to suppress women. And I think that, campaigns like He for She, for example, is just one big one, have shown that, there are a lot of men in a lot of places that have felt very constrained by perhaps the political situation, the governmental strictures, but they themselves were husbands, brothers, they have mothers, they have sisters, they have daughters, they have wives, and they want to help. They want to be a part of the solution.
That is absolutely correct. And in fact, I was on the board of the Afghan Women's Writing Project, and many of the women who wrote in that project would talk about that their fathers were the one who really encouraged them to go to school.
Yeah, Jessica.
To live their dreams.
Yeah, Jessica, what do you think about that?
I think that it can be really hard for men to stand up. I think those 20 men are really brave, and they take a lot of flack for standing up. But I think it's really important to highlight them because they are the role models of the future for other men. And men have a lot of power, and men can do a lot to promote women's rights. And I think there's a growing understanding that equality is good for men as much as it's good for women, that it really creates a better framework for families and communities. So I think men are increasingly realizing that, and we have to change the culture. And one of the best ways to do that is to highlight role models.
I think that's a great point. And also, just to go back to something we discussed about the percentages that, Ashraf Ghani wanted to have 38% of his cabinet being made up of women. And again, in our own country, in the United States, for comparison's sake, I've got a comment here from my supervisor and producer, Patrick Meneman, who says the Obama administration cabinet is only 18% women. Once again, just showing how, it does take, if it's a man in power, as it is in this country at the moment, President Obama is in power, it really does then take him, and it behooves him not to want to increase that percentage, really, really push to increase that percentage. And, obviously this is a week where Senator Barbara Mikulski's retiring, and the idea that she really blazed a trail for women and to get more women into positions of power and positions of leadership in politics in particular. And I think we shouldn't forget that, and we should definitely try and build on that. But let's move on quickly, because I want to talk about funding, because how does foreign funding figure into all of this? A new piece on slate.com explores what happens to Afghan women when the US military pulls out. Now, it's a provocative question. Jessica, when we're talking about bolstering female leadership, how does that vacuum that's left after a troop and funding withdrawal impact that, particularly when we're talking, as Amber keeps talking about as well, this safe space? When you don't have a safe space and you don't have the funding that is then establishing this safe space for women, how does that impact women's rights?
Well, I think there's a huge amount of funding when you're talking about troop withdrawal and the funds that are used for military interventions like that. If even a small portion of that funding could be channeled directly to women in these countries where we have big military operations, the impact might be far greater, and you could get quite a lot more bang for the buck, and ultimately it would be a more sustainable model. And I think that's where there's been a lot of fatigue with all of these troop deployments, but at the same time, the extent to which they're really, in the long run, building a civil society capacity that you can count on to protect people within a country rather than through some kind of outside mechanism that usually doesn't seem to work very well. I just think it's a no-brainer that getting more money to women on the ground is a lot more efficient and a lot more effective.
Oh, absolutely, I agree.
I think that's, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. I think that's I think that's totally right, and I want to just echo what Jessica just said. I think that the point that getting money on the ground and moving it into programs, into organizations that are on the ground, that are equipping and supporting the women in Afghanistan to be able to acquire the skills, the knowledge, and the resources so that they can enter into a position in which they can contribute to the growth and stability of their country is essential. And, we see and hear repeatedly that there are significant amounts of money that are moving into post-conflict regions, and we've seen it over and over again. But the lesson that we bring to this conversation is a simple one. The money's not getting to the most marginalized women who, frankly, are the foundation of these communities and of these countries. And if you want that stability, you have to invest in building the skills of women. It's building the capacity of women to be able to be engaged not only in influencing decisions at home and supporting their families and being able to support the education of their children, but also being able to contribute to the growth of that local economy. Because at the end of the day, if the country is not able to see movement in that positive direction, the reality of extreme poverty, facilitates and fuels the conditions that lead to recurring conflict. And then you start to see, a lot of the instability spread across the region. And I think that when we think about this post-troop investment, especially in Afghanistan, really holding accountable and raising awareness and bringing attention to the amazing work that local groups are doing in Afghanistan is absolutely, absolutely important and critical, because the change that happens that is small and incremental that we can't see is profound when you start to see the aggregate in local communities.
I think that's an excellent point, and it goes back to what we were saying, doesn't it, about like local groups driving things. What do we think about situations like Nigeria, for example, where we've seen the influx of Boko Haram. I've just got an article here. This is just today. Boko Haram extremists kill at least 45 in a Nigerian village. The group's 6-year campaign to carve out the Islamic State in northeast of Nigeria has killed thousands and displaced over 1.5 million people, really taking us back to the start of this whole conversation, right? Displaced women and what that really means. And of course, the other side of this is rape. I mean, let's talk a little bit about specifically conflict and instances of rape. Now, the headlines this week and in months prior have taken a harrowing look at the rape culture in India in particular. This week, the country ordered television stations to not air British filmmaker Leslie Udwin's film, India's Daughter. It's a documentary about the gang rape on a New Delhi bus in 2012 that ended with a 23-year-old victim, Jyoti Singh, dying from the injuries that she sustained. Now, in the film, Udwin interviews the bus driver, Mukesh Singh, from the jail. He was one of the rapists, the convicted rapists, who tells Udwin that, quote, "A girl is far more responsible for rape than a boy. A decent girl won't roam around at 9 o'clock at night. Housework and housekeeping is for girls, not roaming in discos and bars at night doing wrong things, wearing wrong clothes." Now, Singh added that because he's facing the death penalty, it will impact other men, saying, quote, "Now when they rape, they won't leave the girl like we did, they will kill her." Indian officials are saying, why give a platform to a rapist? But seeing that this kind of opinion exists seems not just scary, but important. Patricia, what do you think?
I think it's really important for us to be aware of, those perspectives, but even more important for us to present a counter narrative. Yeah, I mean, because I think that there's this whole notion that it is a woman's fault that she is a victim of violence, is perverse, and we need to call it what it is, and it's criminal. Yeah, and we, if we don't present a counter narrative, then you'll continue to hear these things, and people use that as a justification, for violence against women. And it's just absolutely wrong. It's just absolutely criminal, and we need to call it what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a comment here from Justice Holmes, who's watching, who says rape is used as a weapon against women and entire villages. In this case, it's all part and parcel as well, isn't it, Jessica, of a culture? There's a kind of cultural underpinning to what Singh is saying, and this is part and parcel of why the Indian government really didn't want the film to be broadcast.
That's right, but I think actually rape is part of a global culture.
Yeah.
And what he said and how he was quoted, I think that says exactly what so many men in so many countries say when they blame the victim. Maybe he said it in a little bit more extreme way, but I think that it's definitely a universal phenomenon, and I think what it really points to, and what we're all saying, is there's a culture of impunity that allows men to get away with rape. And it's not just rape in war, it's rape in what we call peace, but there's a war on women continues in peacetime. And here in this country, we see just an epidemic of rape on campus, rape in the military, rape everywhere. So I think it's really a global phenomenon, and we all have more in common than we do differ on some of these issues. So I think him saying that it's really about how it's presented, not whether it's presented. We all know that underlying a lot of rape, there's a sense of impunity and a sense of the woman's to blame. So I think that the issue should be focused on how do we change that culture? And part of sometimes changing a culture is really looking at it, but I do think it's a global culture.
Yeah, I mean, I like sort of running with this idea that it's a global culture, because then there's sort of no blame narrative as well. We're not blaming necessarily one nation or one nation's men or one nation's women as well, because there are a lot of women that hear what Singh said and sort of nod their heads in agreement and think, yeah, that makes sense. And so it is kind of an education en masse that we need to change. But very quickly, because we're running out of time, but I mean, how do we do that? I mean, where does that education start?
Well, I think that education starts with a conversation, and I think it begins by being able to have the discussion and being able to confront the ideas that are out there in our communities, in our homes, and being able to talk about that and hear the voices and engage women and men on what unpacking what those mean and the consequences of not doing something, not standing up and saying no more against domestic violence, intimate partner violence in all of its forms, is a very significant, it's a very significant first step. We have to be willing to recognize as bystanders and as members of a community that violence against women is pervasive. It's pervasive in every culture. And unless we acknowledge it and recognize it, then we can say no more to it and engage in ensuring that we're shifting attention from the victims to the perpetrators and the system that allows those perpetrators to act with impunity. And I think that's essential.
I think it's a really good point. And, just sort of very quickly on that note, 2014, I feel like was the year where we were talking about feminism and feminists and what it means and what it is and what it looks like and who is one and who isn't one and all of that jazz. And it feels like to me that 2015 is a year where we're now established, hopefully, some foundation again, and we can start acting upon these ideas and acting and seizing upon this kind of education pattern as well, because we don't want to have a rehash of the same argument. I feel like, this has got to be a brand new chapter in what we're doing and how we're going to build on that. And on that very same note, normally here we add in a beat that's called 3 Steps Back, which is the worst of the news in the week. But considering all that we've covered and all of the very serious challenges that women face around the world, let's just end on a more upbeat note, because this week's One Step Forward comes from Maison Al-Melehan, a 16-year-old now dubbed the Malala of Syria, who's been going to a refugee camp in Jordan every morning, encouraging girls to leave their tents and continue their education. Now, Patricia, we talk about the future of women and how education is so central to this. How does her story really evince the hope that you can have in the midst of some very dire circumstances?
I think it really shows us that there is a resilience, right, in communities. And there is a resilience that even young girls have. In the midst of, very dire, conflict-ridden circumstances where they continue to dream and they have a vision, and with a little bit of support, they take it to the next level.
Yeah.
And so we need to spend less money on the military and more money on these kinds of programming so that we can transform our societies and make the world a better place.
Yeah, Jessica, what do you think?
I think there are Malalas all over the world. I've met many of them, and I think what in part made Malala so famous was that she was shot in the head. And I think what we need to do is figure out a way to make these girls famous without having to see that kind of violence, because what they're doing is groundbreaking and it's going to change the future for everybody.
I think that's a really important point. Yeah, Amber, just your final thoughts on that note.
We've actually, in celebration of International Women's Day, we are highlighting stories of the Malalas and the moms and the dads who inspire us with a campaign called She Inspires Me. And we're hoping that and seeing folks share their story, and we're sharing those stories because I think just like combating violence, we also need positive stories, Caroline. And so on this International Women's Day, we're inviting everyone to share a story of a woman who inspires them and use the hashtag She Inspires Me. And I think that's essential. It's important. She is a light. And I think there are thousands and thousands of lights out there. And we just need to look at them and hold them up and share them so that we can have the hope that inspires us and it continues to fuel our desire to stand up to the injustice and also support those who are making tremendous differences in their communities around the globe.
Absolutely. Well, I have to say, you've all inspired me today, so much so. I want to thank you all so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. And guys, thank you so much as well. And I hope that you've been inspired by this conversation too. If you want to find out more about any of the stories that we've been discussing and find all of our guest work, you can check out the links in our resource well below. And I want to thank all of our guests again in particular today for having absolutely brilliant conversation about the global advancement for women's rights. And you can visit all of the organisations and get involved. It's Women Thrive Worldwide. We've got Donor Direct Action represented here today, and also, of course, Women for Women International. And if you've got suggestions for stories, you can tweet me at CaroMT, use the hashtag WMN, and stay here. The conversation always continues on HuffPost Live.